But let's carry on, because as the situation intensifies in war-torn Ukraine, missile explosions rocking several Ukrainian cities, diplomats from several countries in the national capital have joined hands in protesting against the attacks. The envoys of different countries, mainly from European countries and the Western world, gathered in front of the Ukrainian embassy in New Delhi to show their support. The diplomats have taken out a solidarity march holding candlelights. This took place on the weekend, and there have been various diplomats attending those candlelight marches during this week outside the Ukrainian embassy. Now, one of those ambassadors is the High Commissioner of Britain to India, Ellis. Alex Ellis is joining me. I spoke to him a short while ago. Mr. Ellis, you and other diplomats from Western nations coming out with candlelight vigils outside the Ukrainian embassy, all very well, but there will be one nagging question I want to start with. Would your reaction have been the same had a similar aggression taken place, God forbid, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, dare I say in the subcontinent? When aggressions take place in these parts of the world, why don't you react in the same way? Is there an element of double standards because this is happening in Europe? That's why there's so much of anger among Western diplomats?
There is so much anger, not just in Europe, but across the world, because this is an unprovoked invasion by an autocracy of its smaller democratic neighbor, with miles of tanks pouring into the territory, with missiles being fired indiscriminately in major cities, with loss of life. This is a totally extraordinary and terrible event. That's why there is anger, not just in Europe, but all over the world, as we saw in the UN last week and this week.
But Mr. High Commissioner, the Russians in turn are saying, look, NATO has violated agreements in the past, conventions in the past. NATO is encircling us, is pushing us into a corner. Therefore, this war is the result of Russia's legitimate security concerns being ignored, the fear of being encircled. Putin says this is not unprovoked. The West has much to answer.
There are legitimate security concerns of the people and nation of Ukraine, with a democratically elected government, which has just been invaded by hundreds of thousands of troops from its neighbor. And on the Russians, let's not forget, I think Sergei Lavrov said, the foreign minister, just at the end of last month, there won't be a war as far as it depends on the Russian Federation. We don't want a war. This was completely unprovoked. It was unnecessary, and it is leading to terrible consequences. We've seen the tragic death of the Indian student today. We have, I think, millions of Ukrainians internally displaced. We have hundreds of thousands of people now leaving the country, including some other Indian students. This is down to Putin, no more, no less.
Given the fact that you all are taking this strong stand, would you therefore like India also to take a stronger stand, condemning the Russians, voting along with you at the United Nations General Assembly, where we've abstained from a vote condemning the attacks? Are you expecting India also, in a way, to be part of your Western coalition?
So firstly, I very strongly agree with what the Indian ambassador to the United Nations said in explaining the Indian abstention last week about the importance of international law, the respect for sovereignty, the territorial integrity, and the UN Charter. And Putin has fired a missile through the UN Charter in the last week. Secondly, I completely welcome the Indians' supply of government of India's supply of humanitarian aid, which they talked about today. Thirdly, I totally understand the focus on Indian students, like any country, we focus on getting your nationals out of such a terrible situation. I think what we need to do now is to look ahead. This is going to run and run. This is a very big event, and we have to be slow but united and determined in showing to President Putin that autocratic militarism and aggression and invasion won't work.
But do you believe really, Mr. High Commissioner, that the sanctions of the kind Britain, the United States are putting in place will actually rein in Mr. Putin? Or is the truth that the West is simply actually unable to really rein in the Russian leader's expansionism? You got him wrong. You didn't really expect him to go this far. And now you're struggling to find a way in which you can end this conflict.
It's a very fair question. We have, of course, put sanctions in place of different kinds. We put in sanctions on individuals, over 100, on companies. We've now effectively frozen Russian central bank and Russian banks out of raising money in the UK, which, you know, one of the biggest financial centres in the world, certainly the biggest in Europe. We've banned Aeroflot, as many of the European countries. The German government's taken the excellent decision on the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. Those are having effect. Now, they don't deter the immediate militarism, building up of hundreds of thousands of troops, and then the indiscriminate violence, which is bloodshed, which is taking place in Ukraine. But they are having an effect. I think the ruble's dropped by about 40%, something like that, the currency in the last week. The stock exchange lost about $250 billion. So it's having an effect. Now, that effect is over a long term. Of course, the more we can widen that, the better. So we can't stop the immediate military attack, although the UK has been training troops for many years in Ukraine to try and deal with this kind of situation. But if we keep at it, I think we could have a long-term effect and a signal to others, not just in Europe, but around the world.
But Mr. Ellis, has the Western world reacted too late? There is criticism, Mr. High Commissioner, that this could have perhaps been averted had the Western world negotiated better, tried to look for solutions, that you underestimated what Putin was about to do. And there are strong business ties that Europe has with Russian administration, with the oligarchs of Russia.
Well, I think let's hold responsibility where it lies, which was President Putin for deciding to amass an army of hundreds of thousands and then invade his neighbour. UK has been working with Ukraine for the last 7 years since the Crimea annexation in 2014. We've trained over 20,000 troops. We've been providing all kinds of logistical support as well. We called out Putin's intentions very early. We unusually took a step along with some partners and allies of setting out our intelligence. What it was telling us that Putin was planning to invade. We set in a certain number of sanctions. We said we'll go further. We've tried, but none of this has worked. And so he has invaded. And so we now need to go much further, and nothing is off the table in terms of the sanctions which we'll put in place. I should say we are always open and seeking the path of diplomacy and ways to get out of this situation. And we've tried that, and we've held some sanctions. It didn't work, so now we have to go further.
You know, there is also, Mr. High Commissioner, an unfolding humanitarian crisis. You said yourself that this is not going to end in a hurry. Given that this is a prolonged conflict, does the Western world, do you see an end game at all here?
So that will depend on whether President Putin is prepared to listen to the UN Secretary General. He said the soldiers have to return to the barracks, the leaders have to return to peace. And he too emphasized the importance of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Those are the basic principles on which any diplomacy needs to take place. We'll always keep the diplomatic option open, but we also have to be very firm in our response, not just in the immediate sense that we've also, of course, supplied anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainians. We're doing that now for several weeks already, but also in terms of reinforcing the borders of NATO. One of the many bits of nonsense that comes out of the Putin administration, this is all NATO's fault. Russia actually aligns with its borders only 6% of the NATO territory. So it's really about Putin and his vision of essentially not allowing an independent country to be able to control its own destiny. But that has to change. That's why we have to have all the sanctions in place as well as the diplomacy.
But has this in some way exposed the weaknesses of the post-Cold War era? The West's limitations. There is no global superpower out there. A weakening United States can't rein in the likes of Putin. And somewhere the institutional structures like the UN or indeed the EU or NATO just cannot rein in the likes of Putin. The world today has no institutional structures in place to rein in someone who wants to enter another country.
I agree. We are in a post-Cold War order. That is a much more competitive world where there is genuine competition about the way countries are run. Don't forget, why is President Putin really doing this? He's doing this because he fears that Ukraine wants and will get what you and India have, what we in the United Kingdom have, which is democracy and opportunity. I remember the time when people complained that there was one superpower in the world and said it was a terrible thing. This is a more fragmented world. There is more power distributed, but the principles on which that, which the post-1945 order was created, including the UN Charter, they remain and they apply all around the world. So what's happening in Ukraine matters not just for the people of Ukraine, for anyone else, but it also matters for the rest of the world. And what the rest of the world will see in terms of the vigor with which I think many countries across the world have come together. It's actually had a galvanizing effect of bringing countries together and getting to be more dynamic and more determined.
One more nagging question, Mr. Ellis. God forbid if China were to commit a similar act of aggression against India, Would the Western world support us? I started by asking you double standards, hypocrisy. When Galwan happened, we didn't see outrage that we see now from the Western world. It leaves Indians wondering, why should we be part of this coalition of Western nations now?
Because I think every country, every democracy values the UN Charter. And the world has changed a lot, even in the last 2 years. I think about the effects of COVID accelerating some of the big change in terms of geopolitical and great power competition, and the need for democracies to come together to support the values which we share. So I think the UK, like many other countries actually, is much more focused now on the Indo-Pacific. That's why we've had an Indo-Pacific tilt. That's why we've had so many regular visitors to India in the last 18 months, why we have a roadmap between by Prime Ministers Modi and Boris Johnson, which looks at defence and security, and we're already delivering on that, for example, through the visit of our new carrier strike group, the aircraft carrier surrounding ships with allies late last year. There's a big shift going on, I think, even in the last 2 years, and the UK is determined to be part of that, whether it's in the European theatre or in other parts of the world, because it is in our interest and on our values to do so.
Let me press you one last time. If there was an unprovoked aggression by the Chinese on our Indian soil, will the United Kingdom stand by India or not, sir?
Well, get into hypotheticals. We're in for a long game in terms of the promotion of democracy and our values, which India shares as the world's largest democracy and one of the world's oldest democracies.
Let's leave it there, Mr. High Commissioner. Appreciate your joining us, taking the time off to give us where the Western world really stands at the moment on Ukraine and why you believe that this is a principled stand that you've taken. Thanks very much for joining me now.